It was early October when I decided to go on a solo hiking trip through the Stanislaus National Forest in Northern California. I had been planning it for months. Work had worn me down, and I felt like I needed to unplug from everything. No calls, no emails, no noise. Just trees, sky, dirt, and my own breath for a few days. I picked a loop trail that I hadn't done before, about 26 miles total, with some good elevation and a few water crossings. I planned to stretch it out across 3 days, camping in the backcountry. The forecast looked decent. Cool days, cold nights, no storms on the radar. Sounded perfect. I had my gear packed tight. I double-checked everything before leaving the house. Lightweight tent, sleeping bag, food for 3 days, water filter, extra layers, topo map, GPS, compass, first aid kit, headlamp, and a small knife. I also packed a whistle, just in case I ever needed to signal for help. Even though I didn't think I'd have to, I drove out to the trailhead that morning. It was a 2-hour drive through smaller and smaller roads. The parking lot was nearly empty when I got there. Just one other truck. I signed into the logbook at the trailhead kiosk and strapped on my pack. The air was cool and dry. The sun filtered through the tall pines. Everything looked like it was going to be a smooth trip. The first 5 miles were nothing special. Mostly pine forest with a gradual uphill climb. My legs felt strong. I passed a small stream and filled one of my bottles. I didn't see another person the whole time. It was quiet in a peaceful way, with just the wind and the sound of squirrels running through the dry leaves. By late afternoon, I'd made it to a small clearing where I had planned to set up camp for the night. It was a flat spot near a creek, with just enough open space for my tent and a small fire. I got everything set up, ate a cold meal, and crawled into my sleeping bag as the last light disappeared. The first night was quiet. I woke up a couple of times to the sound of branches cracking in the woods, but that's pretty normal in the forest. Small animals, mostly. I didn't worry. I just shifted in my bag, closed my eyes, and drifted back off. The second day started early. I boiled some water for coffee and oatmeal, packed up camp, and hit the trail. This was supposed to be the most challenging leg, about 12 miles, with more elevation gain and some steeper switchbacks. But I was ready for it. The trail narrowed and became rougher as I climbed higher. Parts of it were washed out from old storms. I had to scramble in a few places, using my hands to get over loose rocks. Around noon, I stopped for a break and realized I hadn't seen a single person in nearly 24 hours. That didn't bother me at first. It was one of the reasons I'd chosen this route. Less traffic, more solitude. But as I sat there, eating some jerky and staring out at the ridgeline ahead, I noticed something odd. Way off to the side, maybe 300 yards up the slope, I saw movement. Just for a second. It was like a shadow passed through the trees. I stared for a while, squinting, waiting to see it again. Nothing moved. I figured it was probably a deer or maybe a bear moving off. I told myself not to dwell on it and kept going. By mid-afternoon, I started noticing something else that felt off. The trail markers had become more and more faded. Some were missing altogether. I had the map and GPS, so I wasn't worried about getting lost, but it made me wonder how often this part of the trail was used. Everything felt a bit more overgrown. There were more fallen trees. Some sections had no clear path at all. I reached the second camp area by early evening. It was on a small rise overlooking a narrow valley, with a slow-moving creek at the bottom. I dropped my pack and stood there for a while, just listening. It was quiet, not peaceful like before, just still. I set up my tent near some large boulders and made a quick meal. I didn't feel like building a fire this time. I felt a little unsettled for some reason. I tried to brush it off. Long hikes do that sometimes. Your mind gets weird. I got in my sleeping bag, zipped the tent shut, and tried to sleep. But that night wasn't quiet. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound outside the tent. It was faint at first, something moving through the brush. Slow, deliberate, not the quick darting steps of a rabbit or squirrel. Heavier. I lay still, holding my breath, listening. The steps circled the tent once, then again. I could hear them in the dry leaves. Then they stopped. I waited. A full minute. Nothing. Then something brushed against the side of my tent. Just a slight drag, like a hand sliding across the fabric. I froze. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might shake the whole tent. But nothing else happened. No sounds. No movement. After a long time, I sat up and grabbed my knife. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The moon was bright. I could see the area clearly. Nothing there. No animals. No people. No tracks. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stayed awake until dawn. I just sat there, staring at the tent flap, gripping the knife in my lap. As soon as the sky lightened, I packed up. I didn't even eat breakfast. I wanted to be moving. The third day was supposed to be the easy leg, just 9 or so miles, mostly downhill. But it felt like the longest part of the whole trip. Every sound made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder. At one point, I swore I heard footsteps behind me on the trail. I stopped and waited. Nothing. Then, an hour later, I saw something that made my blood run cold. At a fork in the trail, I saw footprints. Not animal prints, boot prints. And not mine. I stopped and looked at them closely. They were fresh. The dirt was still crumbling around the edges. The tread pattern wasn't the same as mine. Someone had passed through here, maybe less than an hour ahead of me. I followed them. I didn't really have a choice. They went the same direction I was going. After about 2 miles, the prints left the trail and cut into the woods. I didn't follow. I kept moving. But then I saw something even worse. Up ahead, tied to a branch at eye level, was a piece of red cloth. It was ripped and frayed, like it had been torn from a shirt. It looked fresh, not sun-faded or dirty. Someone had left it there not long ago. And I noticed something else. Scratches on the bark below it. Deep ones. 3 of them running parallel. I don't know why, but I took off running. I dropped my pace and just started moving fast. I didn't stop for water. I didn't stop to check the map. I just ran. I tripped more than once. Scraped my hand and my knee. Didn't care. Eventually, after what felt like hours, I saw the edge of the parking lot through the trees. My car was still there. The other truck was gone. I got in, locked the doors, and sat there, trying to breathe. My whole body was shaking. I couldn't explain any of it. Not fully. Maybe someone was out there hunting. Maybe a squatter. Maybe just a messed up person looking to scare someone. All I know is that I wasn't alone. And I should have turned back when I saw the first signs. That night still lives in my head. That soft drag across the tent. Those slow, heavy steps. The footprints. The red cloth. I still hike. But I don't go alone anymore. And I don't ignore the signs. Not ever again. I've been hiking alone for years. It started as a way to get out of the house during a rough time in my life. Then it became a habit. After a while, it was just something I did. Most weekends, if I had time off, I'd look for a trail that wasn't crowded and take off early in the morning with a backpack, some food, a first aid kit, and a basic map. I'd learned not to rely on my phone. Reception always cuts out when you actually need it. This trip started out just like the others. I had a 3-day weekend and found an old Forest Service trail listed on a hiking forum. Northeast side of the state, barely known, steep elevation gain, and a remote feel. That's what I liked. Remote meant quiet. Remote meant I could think clearly. I printed the map, packed food for 2 nights, filled up my water bottles, and left before dawn. The drive out was long, through a couple of small towns and then a rough dirt road that wound through thick pine forest. At one point, I had to get out and move a fallen branch to keep going. That's how I knew I was close. Around noon, I pulled into a tiny gravel area at the trailhead. There were no other cars. I liked that. The air was cooler than I expected. It smelled like pine needles and wet soil. I stepped out of the car, stretched, and did my usual check. Phone off, emergency beacon in my pocket, pack secure, bear spray in the side pouch, shoes tight. I didn't expect trouble, but I liked being prepared. That's another thing you learn after years of hiking. Comfort makes you careless. Carelessness gets people hurt. The trail started off with a slight incline, weaving through tall trees and patches of thick underbrush. There were birds calling from high up, and I could hear my own breathing clearly. I didn't bring music or earbuds or anything like that. I liked the sound of the woods. Every crack of a branch or snap of a twig kept me aware. It made the whole thing feel real. The first 2 hours were uneventful. The trail was overgrown but still followable. I passed a few old markers nailed to trees, faded white paint flaking off the wood. At one point, I stepped over a fallen log and found a small campsite on the left side of the trail. There were the remains of a fire ring and some chopped wood. It looked like no one had used it in months, maybe longer. I made a mental note of it and kept moving. By late afternoon, I was about 5 miles in and starting to feel the weight of my pack. I had a blister forming on my right heel, so I stopped near a small creek to rest and eat something. I took my boots off, let my feet breathe, and soaked a bandana in the cold water to wipe the sweat off my face. Felt good. I pulled out the map again to double-check my position. The trail I was on was called Big Ridge Cutoff. According to the paper, it used to be connected to another longer route that looped back to the parking area. But sometime in the last decade, a rock slide wiped out that section. Now, the cutoff just dead-ended about 8 miles in. Hikers were supposed to turn back the same way they came. I didn't mind. I planned to hike to the end, set up camp, and head back the next morning. After the break, I kept going. The trail narrowed, brush got thicker, and it started climbing sharply. I had to stop more often to catch my breath. There were no switchbacks, just a steady, steep climb up the side of a ridge. Dirt gave way to loose gravel in some places, and I had to watch my footing. If I slipped, I'd slide a long way. Around 6 in the evening, I reached the top of the ridge. The view opened up, and I could see miles of forest on all sides. No houses, no roads, no other hikers. Just trees and sky. The wind up there was strong. Pulled at my jacket and made the trees creak. I felt a strange chill, even though it wasn't that cold. Just a feeling I couldn't shake. I followed the ridge trail until it started sloping down again. About half a mile later, I found another small flat area just off the trail. It looked like a good place to set up camp. Level ground, no dead trees above, close enough to the trail but still private. I pitched my one-person tent, changed into dry socks, and made a small cold dinner from a pouch of tuna and some crackers. I didn't build a fire. I rarely did. Fires attract attention. Animals, people, both. That night, I couldn't sleep well. I kept hearing things. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, even a strange clinking sound at one point, like metal hitting stone. Every time I sat up and listened hard, the noise would stop. Then nothing, just silence and wind. I told myself it was deer or maybe a raccoon, but I couldn't relax. I lay there for hours, staring at the roof of the tent, waiting for sleep to come. Didn't. The next morning, I packed up early. My plan was to reach the end of the trail, take a quick rest, and then start heading back to the car. I figured if I moved quickly, I could make it all the way back in one long push. I wanted to sleep in my own bed that night. The trail continued downhill, winding deeper into thicker forest. The trees here were older, their trunks blackened and mossy. The sunlight barely reached the ground. Everything smelled wet and earthy. I started seeing signs that the trail wasn't used much. Logs across the path, ferns growing in the middle, even a spot where a small landslide had pushed part of the trail down the slope. I had to climb over it using roots as handholds. About a mile from the end, I reached a fork. That confused me. The map hadn't shown any junctions. One path kept going forward like I expected, but the other curved off to the left, disappearing into denser brush. There was no sign or marker, just the split. I hesitated. Something about the left path didn't feel right. It looked too narrow, like it hadn't been used in years. The brush was almost waist-high in places. Still, I was curious. I dropped my pack, took a long drink of water, and decided to follow the left path for a few minutes, just to see where it went. Maybe it led to a viewpoint or an old cabin. The thought of finding something abandoned out here always intrigued me. The path quickly became harder to follow. It dropped into a shallow ravine, then rose up the other side. Branches slapped my face. I had to duck under fallen trees. The air felt heavier here. The trees were packed tighter. I kept going. Then I saw it. Not a cabin or lookout tower, just an old steel gate. It was half buried in the earth and tilted at an angle, like it had been pushed over years ago. There was no fence, no wall, just this broken gate standing alone in the woods. Behind it, the path continued, more overgrown now. I stood there for a while, just staring at it. Something about it bothered me. Why would there be a gate here, so deep in the woods, with no sign of a road or structure? I couldn't explain it. I took a few steps forward, past the gate. That's when I started noticing the signs. Trash. Not fresh, but not ancient either. A crumpled energy drink can. A torn tarp half buried in mud. A boot print, big, deep, dried and cracked mud. The toe pointed downhill. Someone had come through here. More than once, maybe. I kept going slower now. The trail curved sharply and then dropped into a small gully. At the bottom, I saw something that made me stop cold. A backpack, just sitting there against a tree, covered in dirt and leaves like it had been there for months. I walked closer. The fabric was faded red. The zippers rusted. I knelt down and opened it. Inside were a few granola bar wrappers, an empty water bottle, and a small spiral notebook. I flipped through the notebook. Most of the pages were smeared or torn, but on the last page, someone had scribbled a few words in thick pencil. The letters were shaky and dark, like they'd pressed too hard. He watches from the ridge. Don't go back. I stared at the words. My skin went cold. Not from fear, more like confusion. Was it a joke? A prank left by someone who wanted to scare hikers? But who would come all the way out here just to do that? I took the notebook with me and turned around. I had seen enough. The way back felt longer. The trail didn't look the same in reverse. At one point, I took a wrong turn and had to backtrack 20 minutes. When I finally made it back to my pack, I checked the map again. That offshoot trail wasn't listed at all, like it didn't exist. I kept moving, heading back the way I came, but something was different now. The woods felt less quiet, more watchful. I found myself looking over my shoulder constantly. I stopped more often to listen. I saw new boot prints on the trail. Not mine, not old. Deep, recent, heading the same direction I was going. That's when I started moving faster. I didn't run, but I walked hard, pushing through branches, ignoring the burning in my legs. I didn't stop to eat. I didn't stop to drink. I just wanted to get out. Then I heard the whistle. It came from somewhere behind me, high-pitched, short, then low and drawn out, like someone signaling. I froze. Every hair on my body stood up. I waited, heart pounding. The sound didn't come again. I didn't wait for it. I started moving again, even faster this time. About a mile from the trailhead, the path. I don't know why I picked that trail. Maybe it was because I'd done all the others around the area and wanted something new. Maybe it was just a dumb decision. Either way, I can say for sure now that it wasn't worth it. No hike is worth feeling like you're not going to make it back alive. I've been hiking solo for a few years by then. I wasn't an expert, but I knew enough. I had my GPS device, my physical map, my compass, my phone, extra batteries, a first aid kit, food for 3 days even though I was only planning to be out for one, water purification tablets, a good knife, a small emergency tent, and a couple of lighters. I didn't take risks with gear. I packed smart, stayed on trail, and never tried to be a hero. That's probably why I'm still here to write this. It was a Tuesday morning in early October when I parked my truck at the trailhead. The place was called Old Pine Ridge Trail, but no one really mentioned it online. I only found it by zooming in on Google Maps and noticing a faint line between two other bigger, more popular routes. The official site didn't have much information on it either. That should have been the first red flag. The trail started off like most do. Pretty trees, the quiet crunch of my boots on the dirt, birds doing their thing. The temperature was cool, around 60 degrees, perfect for hiking. The sun was up, but not too strong yet, filtered through tall pine trees that had clearly been around longer than I had. I kept a steady pace for the first hour. There weren't any signs, but I had the route saved on my GPS. I checked it every 30 minutes just to make sure I was still on track. The trail was faint, barely a footpath in some areas, but it was there. That's what made me feel like it was still in use, just not popular. That, and I found some boot prints that didn't look too old. About 2 hours in, the trail got weird. Not dangerous, just weird. The trees started thinning out in strange patches, not in the way trees usually do. There were clumps of dead trunks in circular groups like they had been burned or infected, but only in certain spots. Then, after about 20 feet, the forest would look normal again. It wasn't just once either, it happened every quarter mile or so. I stopped and stared at a few of the dead patches, but didn't want to waste too much time. I figured maybe a disease had spread through here at one point. Trees get sick too. I kept walking. By mid-afternoon, I was deep in the woods. No cell service, which I expected. Still had GPS. The trail started climbing higher and got rockier. I passed over some old logs and even had to climb a small ridge with both hands. But nothing too bad. I stopped to eat a protein bar and drink some water. That's when I noticed the silence. I hadn't heard birds in a while. Not since noon, maybe earlier. I only realized it because I was sitting still. When you're hiking, you usually don't notice the background noise. But when it's gone, it feels wrong. I looked around. Nothing seemed off. Still trees, still rocks, still sky. I told myself it was probably just the elevation or maybe a natural quiet spot. But the silence made me uncomfortable. It was like the woods were holding their breath. I kept going because I didn't really have a choice. I was at the farthest point from my truck and had already committed to the loop. Turning back would take just as long, and I wanted to finish it before sunset. The trail turned sharply left after the ridge. That's when I hit the first problem. There was a landslide. It wasn't recent, maybe a year old, but it had completely buried the trail under loose rock and dirt for about 30 feet. On the far side, I could see the trail pick up again faintly through the trees, but getting across wasn't going to be easy. Still, it didn't look too bad. I picked my way slowly, one step at a time, testing each rock before putting weight on it. About halfway across, a large flat stone shifted under my boot, and I lost my balance. I didn't fall, but I twisted my left ankle hard. Pain shot up my leg. I dropped to one knee and stayed there for a minute, waiting for the sharp throb to die down. I flexed my foot. It didn't feel broken, but it was tender and already starting to swell. I wrapped it with some sports tape from my kit and took a few slow steps. It hurt, but I could walk. I moved on. Now I was limping slightly and had to slow down. The sun was dipping lower, and I was nowhere near the halfway point. That's when I started thinking I might need to stop for the night. I wasn't planning to camp, but I had gear, and I could find a flat spot somewhere off the trail. I kept an eye out for any place wide enough and dry. About 20 minutes later, I found a clearing. It was a dip between two ridges, maybe 30 feet across, with some dry pine needles covering the ground. I set up my emergency tent quickly. It was just one of those small, one-person bivvy shelters, basically a tube. Not comfortable, but it would keep me dry. I ate a cold meal bar, drank some water, and zipped myself in. My ankle was sore and I wanted to rest it. The temperature dropped fast after dark, and I had to put on an extra thermal shirt and hat. I checked my GPS one last time before trying to sleep. It still showed the trail clearly, and I marked my spot just in case. That night, I barely slept. It wasn't just the cold or the pain in my ankle. It was the noises. I started hearing them just after midnight. Not animals, not owls or coyotes or anything natural. These were snapping sounds, twigs breaking, but too close and too slow, like footsteps but not rhythmic ones. Sometimes they stopped and then started again after 10 minutes. I lay still inside my bivvy, clutching my knife. I didn't unzip it. I didn't look. I just lay there, breathing slowly, hoping it was a deer or something. But deer don't walk in circles around a tent for 3 hours. By 4 a.m., everything went silent again. I stayed awake until dawn, then packed up and moved. I didn't eat breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. My ankle was worse now, stiff and swollen, but I could still walk on it. Slowly, I kept going, checking my GPS every 15 minutes. The signal was still strong, and it said I was on the trail. But something wasn't right. I'd been hiking for almost 2 hours, but I wasn't making any progress on the map. My location marker moved, but it was like I was looping in a small circle. The path on the GPS kept twisting into itself. I zoomed in and out, reset it, even turned it off and on. Same thing. I pulled out my compass and tried to go due north, figuring I'd hit one of the main trails eventually. The problem was the terrain didn't match the map. There should have been a stream and a clearing, but all I saw was thick forest. I even climbed a small ridge to get a better look, and all I saw was more trees. I should have been close to a fire road. That's what the map showed, but it wasn't there. I started to panic. I told myself to calm down, to backtrack to where I slept. I did that. I found my old bivvy spot, even saw the flattened pine needles. That proved I wasn't crazy. I followed the same trail I had used that morning, but the more I walked, the more unfamiliar it felt. Trees looked different. Fallen logs were missing. The terrain was wrong. I was officially lost. That's when I decided to stop moving and make a signal camp. I was still carrying food and water, and my ankle needed rest. I found a small clearing with a wide view of the sky, laid out a bright orange emergency blanket, and started a small smokeless fire with dry wood. Then I waited. The whole day passed without anything. No planes, no hikers, no distant sounds. I blew my whistle every hour. Nothing. As the sun started to go down again, I felt this weight in my chest, a kind of hopelessness. I wasn't just lost. I was alone, fully, truly alone. That night, the footsteps came back. This time, they didn't stop. They stayed close, always just outside my field of vision. I never saw anything, but I could hear them. Slow crunches on dry leaves, then silence, then more steps. Once, I swore I heard breathing. Heavy, labored breathing. I stayed awake again, knife in hand, every muscle in my body tight. I thought about running, but where would I go? By morning, they were gone again. I moved once more. I didn't even follow the GPS now. I just walked toward the sunrise. East, that was my only plan. I walked all day, and still the forest didn't change. No signs, no trails, no fire roads. My food was low and my water even lower. I started chewing pine needles for moisture. That night, I didn't make a fire. I didn't want to be found. On the fourth day, I saw something, an old structure. It looked like a fire watchtower, maybe 30 feet tall, rusted, falling apart. I ran to it even with my ankle. At the base, there was a ladder. Half the rungs were broken, but I climbed anyway. At the top was a small platform with a rotting floor. I looked out and saw forest. Just more trees. No roads, no lights, no buildings. But then, on the horizon, I saw a faint wisp of smoke. I climbed down and limped toward it. It took hours, but by late afternoon, I reached the source. It was a small cabin, old and broken, but someone had recently been there. There were ashes in the fire pit and a half-eaten rabbit nearby. I waited. I had been planning this hiking trip for a while. It wasn't some bucket list thing or anything like that. I just needed to get away from everything. The city, the job, the people. I wanted quiet, something real. I picked a national forest in Oregon. Not too famous, not tourist heavy. I found a trail on an old map that didn't even show up on most apps. It was long, mostly uphill through thick trees and ended near a small lake. The idea of being that far from anyone was exactly what I wanted. I drove out early one morning, got to the trailhead before sunrise, and parked at a small gravel turnout. There was no official sign for the trail, just a faded ribbon tied around a tree. I double-checked everything in my pack. Food, water, sleeping bag, tarp, knife, flashlight, compass, extra socks. I kept it light but made sure I had the basics. I left my phone in the glove box. It wouldn't have worked out here anyway, and honestly, I didn't want it. The first couple of hours were quiet. Birds chirped, and the air was cool. The trail was narrow and overgrown in parts, but I could follow it. Pine needles covered most of the ground, and there were these big mossy rocks everywhere. I liked how it felt, a little forgotten, like no one had come this way in a long time. I didn't see a single person, not a single sign of anyone. Around noon, I stopped to eat, just a protein bar and water, sitting on a flat rock under a big tree. I stayed still for a while, just listening. No traffic, no voices, no engines. Just the wind in the trees and some rustling from squirrels. I kept going after a short rest. As I got deeper into the forest, the trail started fading. In some places, I had to guess where it went. It wasn't completely gone, but it became more of a suggestion than a path. I checked my compass often and kept a mental map of my direction. I didn't want to get lost, but I wasn't too worried yet. I reached the lake by late afternoon. It was small, round, and perfectly still. Trees came all the way down to the edge, except for a narrow clearing with some flat ground and a bunch of old logs. I figured it was a good place to sleep. I set up a basic shelter with the tarp and gathered some dry wood to make a small fire. No one around. Not a sound besides the water and the breeze. The fire helped with the cold. I ate some jerky, drank more water, and stared at the flames. As the sun went down, the shadows stretched out and swallowed everything. The stars came out and they were sharp and bright. No light pollution out here. I stayed awake for a while, just watching the sky. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. The fire had burned out and it was colder. I sat up, rubbing my arms. That's when I heard something. Not close, but not far either. It was a dull thud, like something heavy hitting the ground. Came once, then again after a few seconds. Not fast, not random. It had a rhythm. I stayed completely still, listening. The sound came again, a bit closer. I slowly reached for my flashlight, but didn't turn it on yet. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. My heart was pounding hard. I thought maybe it was a deer or an elk, something big, but it didn't sound like hooves. It was too solid, and it stopped moving after a while. No footsteps, no crunching leaves, just silence again. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed in my sleeping bag, flashlight in hand, eyes wide open, waiting. Nothing else happened for the rest of the night. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my stuff fast and decided I wouldn't stay a second night. I started heading back the way I came, but it didn't take long for me to notice something was wrong. The trail I had followed in looked different. Trees I swore I recognized weren't there. The ground was disturbed in places, like something had walked through, leaving deep impressions in the pine needles. Not boot prints, not paws, just long drag marks. I tried not to panic. I looked at my compass and picked the same direction I'd come from, north. I kept moving, trying to match the path back to my mental map. But things just didn't line up. I wasn't sure anymore if I was on the trail. I looked for signs, broken branches, anything I might have left behind. Nothing. The trees were so thick in parts and the light barely got through. My sense of direction started slipping. Every hill looked the same. Every rock and stump blended together. Around midday, I came across something I hadn't seen before. A small pile of stones stacked neatly in the middle of the trail. It wasn't natural. Someone had placed them there. I walked around it and kept going, but now I was nervous. I kept hearing small noises behind me, twigs snapping, short, quick steps. Every time I stopped, it stopped. I spun around a few times but saw nothing. Eventually, I came to a steep slope. I was sure I hadn't come down this on the way in. I checked the compass again, still north. I thought maybe I had gone around it earlier and not noticed. I decided to keep going down the slope. It was hard on my knees, and the dirt was loose. I slipped a few times but managed. At the bottom, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Another tarp. It was blue, partly covered in leaves and dirt. It looked old and worn out. I stepped closer. It was torn in places. I didn't see any bags or tools, just the tarp. It looked like someone had camped there once and left in a hurry, or never came back. I didn't touch it. I turned and kept walking. I was tired, hungry, and completely unsure of where I was. I didn't want to stop moving. I felt like if I stopped, something might catch up to me. I started marking trees with small scratches from my knife, hoping to avoid walking in circles. A few hours later, I saw one of the scratches again. That was when I knew I was lost. I cursed under my breath and sat down. I needed to think. It was already getting darker. The trees made it worse, blocking out the sun. I didn't want to sleep out here again. not after the noise I heard. But I had no choice. I found a small spot between two rocks and built a quick fire. I ate a little, barely chewing. That night was worse. I heard more noises, closer this time. Something walking through the woods, circling. Sometimes it sounded far, sometimes near. A few times I thought I saw movement between the trees, a shape that didn't belong. I didn't sleep at all. I just sat there with the fire, knife in hand. The next morning, I decided to go west instead of north. I figured if I kept moving in one direction long enough, I'd hit a road or a river or something. I started early and moved fast, stopping only to drink water and catch my breath. Around midday, I finally saw something different, a wooden fence. It was old and broken in places, but it meant people had been here. I followed it. It led me to an old shed, half collapsed, overgrown with vines. No house nearby, just the shed. Inside were some rusty tools, cans, and a moldy sleeping bag. I didn't stay. I kept moving. A few hours later, I saw something even better. A dirt road. Not paved, but clearly used. Tire tracks and everything. I almost cried. I followed it for miles. As the sun started setting, I saw a parked truck in the distance. No one around, but the truck was warm. Someone had just left. I waited there, hoping they'd come back. They didn't, so I walked down the road. Another few hours passed, and finally, headlights appeared behind me. A forest ranger picked me up. I told him I got turned around on a solo hike. I didn't mention the noises or the drag marks or the tarp. I just said I lost the trail and got lucky. When I finally got back to my car 2 days later, I found scratches on the driver's side door. Long, thin ones, too high for an animal, too uneven for a key. I haven't gone hiking since. I still think about it a lot. Not the being lost part, not the fear. It's the fact that someone or something was out there with me, watching, following, maybe leading me away from the trail. And whatever it was, it knew how to move without being seen. It knew how to wait. I've always liked hiking alone. There's something peaceful about being out there, away from everything, just the wind and your footsteps. I wasn't trying to find myself or anything like that. I just liked the quiet. I planned a long weekend to go hiking in northern Idaho, a little off from Priest Lake. I had studied the area, marked a few trails, packed enough food and water, a compass, a topographic map, and my gear. Nothing about it was reckless. I wasn't some thrill seeker. I just liked going out there alone. It was early September, so the weather was still decent. Chilly at night, warm enough during the day. My plan was to do a 2-day hike through some Forest Service land, loop around, and get back to the trailhead by the evening of the 3rd day. No campsites, no cell service, but I had a satellite beacon. I logged the route with my brother just in case. The first day was easy. I followed the ridge above Kalispell Creek, took breaks when I wanted, kept track of time. I remember the sunlight filtering through the trees, the sound of water down below, and how the trail gradually faded the deeper I went. I didn't think much of it. A lot of those Forest Service paths aren't maintained. I set up my tent near a small clearing, not too far from a stream. I had some dehydrated pasta, filtered water, and sat on a log while eating. There were birds, insects, but nothing else. It was quiet, felt right. That night, the cold came fast. I had a good sleeping bag, but I still woke up a couple of times because of the chill. Nothing unusual. Sometime after midnight, I thought I heard a snapping branch, but animals do that all the time. Could have been a deer. I went back to sleep. The next day, I packed up and continued. I planned to follow an old logging road that curved around a ridge. It was barely visible on the map, just a thin line, but I had read that it could still be hiked. At first, it was just overgrown with brush. Then I noticed it wasn't where it was supposed to be. My GPS said I was on track, but the terrain looked different than I expected. I double-checked everything. Still seemed okay. I kept going. By afternoon, I had this strange feeling I was drifting off the route. The logging road thinned out and then seemed to split. One path looked like it dropped into a hollow. The other kept to the slope. Neither matched the map. I picked the slope, thinking I'd keep elevation and find a better view to reorient myself. That was a mistake. After about an hour of walking, the path vanished completely. No markings, no old tire ruts, nothing. The forest thickened, and I started having to push through branches. I kept thinking I'd run into another trail or a landmark. Nothing came. I checked the time, 4:17 p.m. I still had a few hours of light. I tried to backtrack, but the path I'd followed in was already hard to spot. The underbrush covered everything. Every direction looked the same. I've always prided myself on keeping calm, but I felt something shift in my gut. I wasn't panicking yet, but I wasn't okay either. I sat down on a flat rock, pulled out my map, compass, and GPS. My coordinates made no sense. The GPS kept flickering between two spots like it couldn't get a clear signal. I marked my last known position and tried to triangulate based on terrain. That wasn't helpful either. I decided to walk west. The sun would set in a few hours, and west would at least take me closer to the road if I drifted too far east. I walked for almost 2 hours. No trail, no clearing, just trees and more trees. Eventually, I stopped and admitted I was lost. I hadn't seen any recent sign of human activity in hours. No wrappers, no chopped logs, no footprints. Nothing. I set up my tent on a flat patch of dirt and ate a protein bar. I didn't want to use up my hot meals yet. That night was worse. The temperature dropped fast, and the wind picked up. My tent held up fine, but I kept waking up. There were noises, not loud, but enough to pull me out of sleep. A kind of soft rustling, like something moving slowly through the brush. I told myself it was a raccoon or a porcupine, but deep down I didn't believe that. I didn't move. I just lay there holding my breath, waiting. The sound would come and go. Once it got very close. Then it stopped. I didn't sleep much after that. In the morning, the ground was damp. It hadn't rained, but the air was heavy. I packed up, ate another bar, and headed west again. After an hour, I came across a strange arrangement of rocks. 5 small stacks, perfectly shaped, placed in a row. I stopped cold. They didn't look natural. They weren't cairns, too small and too neat. I didn't touch them. I just moved around them and kept walking. My GPS was still acting weird. It would turn on, show my location, then suddenly jump or freeze. I decided not to trust it anymore. I kept moving west, but the terrain got worse. Lots of deadfall, thick brush, uneven ground. I tripped several times. My legs were scratched up. I started feeling tired, really tired. I sat down to rest and realized I hadn't urinated in a while. That scared me. I forced myself to drink more water. By the time the sun began to dip again, I hadn't found anything that looked familiar. I started yelling sometimes, hoping someone might hear. Nothing. I blew my emergency whistle. Nothing. When night fell, I felt something I hadn't felt before, real fear. I wasn't just off trail. I was deep in it. The kind of deep where people don't get found for weeks, if ever. I put on every layer I had and hunkered down. I didn't bother with the tent that night. I was too tired. I found a tree with thick roots, tucked myself into the base, and tried to rest. My stomach growled. I didn't care. I was too scared to eat. Around 1 a.m., I woke up to a sound I couldn't explain. It wasn't an animal. It was rhythmic. Crunch, pause, crunch, pause. Something walking, not trotting or darting, walking. Stopped, then started again. I froze, heart pounding. I couldn't see anything in the dark. I didn't move. It passed behind me, maybe 20 feet away, then slowly faded. When the sun rose, I was already moving. I barely packed anything. Just shoved food in my bag, grabbed water, and moved. I had no plan anymore, just west. Around mid-morning, I found a stream. Clean water. Cold. I filled my bottles, washed my face, and followed it downhill. That was something. Water usually leads to roads or at least to lower ground. I kept walking until late afternoon. My legs ached, and I felt lightheaded. I stopped to eat and rest. That's when I noticed something in the distance. A glint, like metal. I pushed through the brush and found it. A rusted-out truck bed, flipped on its side, half buried in the ground. No wheels, just the frame and rust. It had been there for years, but it meant something. It meant people had been here before. I circled the area and found an old trail. Barely there, but it followed the stream. I took it. That night, I made a fire. I had avoided it before, trying to conserve fuel and stay low, but I needed warmth. I needed something to keep the dark away. I burned some twigs, then bigger sticks. The fire crackled, and for the first time in days, I felt like maybe I'd make it. But then the sound came back. Not footsteps this time, breathing. Slow, deep, and too close. I turned my head. Nothing. The fire danced, the woods were still, but I knew it wasn't just in my head. I didn't sleep. I stared into the trees until sunrise. The next day, I followed the stream trail again. The forest began to change. Less underbrush, more sunlight, and eventually the faintest sign of tire tracks. Then, hours later, I heard something I'd missed so badly. An engine, distant but real. I climbed a ridge and there it was, a logging road. Fresh tracks, cigarette butts, a crushed beer can. People. I walked for hours. At dusk, I saw a hunting cabin. Empty, locked, but with a water barrel and a covered porch. I sat on the porch, leaned against the wall, and cried. I hadn't realized how close I was to breaking. The next morning, I followed the road another few miles and found a fire crew clearing trees. They stared at me like I was a ghost. I looked at two, filthy, sunburned, scratched up, and thinner. They gave me water, food, and a ride back to town. I called my brother. He'd already called search and rescue. They hadn't found anything. I never told them about the breathing, or the footsteps, or how I felt like something was always just behind me. Not a ghost, not some monster, just something real and silent and waiting. I never hiked alone again. I've done solo hikes for most of my adult life. It's the one thing that helps clear my head. No city noise, no deadlines, no one to entertain. Just me, my boots, my pack, and the trail. I don't do it for the thrill or to prove anything. I do it because being out in the middle of nowhere reminds me that I'm small. And somehow that makes everything feel easier to carry. I had a 4-day weekend coming up last fall. I was burned out from work, hardly sleeping, eating garbage, feeling hollow. That always means it's time to get out of the city. I looked at a few maps and picked a spot about 4 hours away, Roaring Gap Wilderness. Not very popular, no marked campsites, and not far from a state line. That meant fewer people. Perfect. I packed everything the night before: tent, sleeping bag, water filter, jet boil, food for 5 days just in case, and all the usual things like my first aid kit, headlamp, paracord, and a basic emergency beacon that I rarely turned on. I also downloaded the topographic maps and a GPS version of the trail because that area was notorious for bad reception and vanishing paths. I left around 5 a.m. Friday, got to the trailhead by 9, parked, and started hiking by 9:30. The air smelled like pine and dirt. It had rained a few days before, so the ground was damp but not muddy. Birds chirped in the canopy. The sky was clear. I felt calm for the first time in weeks. The first few miles were standard. Gentle slopes, dense trees, and occasional openings with a view of the blue ridges stretching out like folds in fabric. I made good time and stopped to eat around noon beside a small stream. I filtered water, ate a protein bar and some jerky, and checked the map. My plan was to do a wide loop that would take me deeper into the range, then bring me around back to the trailhead by Monday. The whole loop was about 35 miles. That first day went smooth. I reached a clearing at around mile 11 by 5 p.m. and set up my tent just off the trail. I had a bit of a hill behind me and a view of a gully below. I made dinner, wrote in my small journal, and sat outside until it got dark enough to see the stars. I hadn't seen another person all day. I slept without trouble and woke early on Saturday. I made coffee, ate a little, packed everything up, and continued down the trail. The trees were thicker here, and the terrain started to slope harder. I passed through a stretch that was mostly switchbacks, and after 2 hours I reached a rocky outcrop that gave me a better view of what I was walking into. Below me was a massive ravine, at least 200 feet deep and maybe a quarter mile across. The trail wrapped along the top edge of it, following the curve for a while before dipping down along the far side. I studied the route on the map and confirmed I was still on track. But the map also had a warning symbol near that part of the trail. Something vague. Just use caution, erosion risk. Nothing new in the wilderness. I figured I'd just move carefully and avoid the edge. The trail narrowed a bit along the ravine. Dirt gave way to looser rock, and I had to watch where I stepped. There were places where the slope had collapsed and left nothing but dry roots and loose stone. At one point, I had to duck under a half-fallen tree that was leaning over the trail like a gate. It was quiet out there, too quiet. No wind, no birds, just my own boots and breathing. Even the insects were gone. I kept walking. Around mile 15, I found a flat spot that looked like a good rest area. It was a patch of dirt surrounded by ferns and thick trees, about 30 feet from the edge of the ravine. I dropped my pack and sat down for a bit. I pulled out my map again, just to see how far I had to go before the trail would curve back and start the loop home. That's when I noticed something weird. My GPS said I was already near mile 16, but the printed map showed I should still be around mile 14. I double-checked my app, but it insisted I was farther than I thought. Maybe I'd walked faster than I realized. Maybe the app was wrong. Either way, it didn't matter much. I knew where I was. I rested for another 20 minutes, filtered some water from a trickle of a stream nearby, then packed up and kept moving. About an hour later, the trail narrowed again, more erosion. I had to keep one foot carefully in front of the other. The ground here was soft and dry, but I could see darker, wet soil under some of the patches. I took another step and felt the edge give slightly under my boot. I froze. There was nothing beneath the crust I had just stepped on. I stepped back slowly and went around it. The edge didn't look like it would hold for much longer. That ravine must have been eating away at the side of the mountain for years. I took it slow after that, walking 10 more minutes until I came to a sharp turn in the trail. The map said I was supposed to head northeast here, but I looked around and realized there wasn't a trail going that way anymore. The bend had collapsed. It was just gone. The trail continued straight instead, into thicker woods. I looked at my GPS again. It was still showing a trail, but it didn't match the new direction I was seeing. The original path had been wiped out, and what was left wasn't even marked. Maybe a game trail, maybe an old reroute. I hesitated, but the thought of going all the way back through those switchbacks didn't appeal to me. I decided to follow the new path. It seemed to stay parallel to the ravine, and I figured it would reconnect with the main trail eventually. Maybe even lead to a better campsite. I walked for another hour, keeping an eye on the edge and watching the sky start to fade. The sun was behind the ridgeline, and the shadows stretched long across the forest floor. I started feeling uneasy. It wasn't fear exactly, just something subtle, like being watched but not in the movie sense. Just that tight feeling in your chest that tells you something is off. I kept walking anyway, until I reached a place where the trail split again. One fork led uphill and away from the ravine. The other kept hugging the edge. I chose the uphill fork. I didn't want to mess around near unstable ground in the dark. I climbed for a while and eventually found a small clearing. It was flat enough to pitch a tent, and there were signs that someone had used the spot before, an old fire ring with charred rocks. I set up camp, ate quickly. It was colder here, and I could see my breath while I sat outside. I crawled into my sleeping bag and lay there for a while, just listening. No wind, no animals, just the sound of my heart and my breathing. I fell asleep eventually, but woke up once to what I thought was a thump outside. I didn't move for a while, just lay there, ears straining. I heard it again, a low, dull thump, not footsteps, just weight, something heavy, dropping or shifting. Then silence. I didn't leave the tent. I waited until it was light again. When I stepped outside in the morning, nothing looked disturbed. No tracks, no animals, just trees and mist. I broke camp quickly and headed uphill. I thought I'd gain some elevation and maybe reconnect with the proper trail. But after 2 hours of hiking, the ground started sloping downward again. The trees grew denser, and the soil got darker and wetter. I realized I was descending into a different part of the ravine from the other side. I tried to turn back, but it was too late. The path I had taken was too steep to climb back up without ropes. The soil was loose, and everything was slick from dew. I knew I'd fall if I tried to climb it. I had no choice but to keep going. I kept hiking downward, using trees to brace my steps. The air got cooler and damper the farther I dropped. I passed strange patches of fungus on the trees, pale white and fuzzy, like frost, even though it was still early fall. I saw no birds, no squirrels, just silence. The trail became more of a gash in the earth than a path. It had clearly been carved by runoff water or erosion, not human traffic. Then I saw the first boot print. It was fresh, deep in the mud, a tread I didn't recognize. I stopped and looked around, heart picking up. There were no voices, no movement, but someone had passed this way recently. I called out instinctively. Nothing replied. I waited for a few minutes, then kept moving, this time more alert. After another mile, I found the remains of a camp.
A torn tarp.
Burnt trash, a rusted mess kit. It looked abandoned. The fire ring was cold, but there were bones scattered nearby. Not human, probably deer. Still, something about it looked rushed, like someone had packed up in a panic. I didn't stop, couldn't. I needed to get out of that ravine. The trail kept going down. The walls of the ravine got higher. The air felt wetter. My socks were soaked from stepping in hidden puddles, and the mud was up to my ankles. Then I heard something behind me, a rustle, a crack, a breath. I turned, but there was nothing, just trees. I started moving faster. I didn't run, not yet, but my pace picked up, and my neck burned from looking over my shoulder too much. Then the trail ended, or rather, it fell away, a full collapse. The ravine had given out, and what used to be the trail was now a vertical drop into blackness. I looked over the edge and saw nothing but shadows. I stood there. It started with a random idea one morning while I was sitting on my back porch with a cup of coffee. I had a week off from work, no plans, and I felt like I needed a break from the noise of the city. I lived in a small apartment close to downtown, and the constant sound of traffic, sirens, and people had started to wear me down. So I decided to do something different. I was going to spend a few days hiking through a remote area I had never been to before. I pulled out my laptop and started searching for places within a reasonable driving distance. I wanted something isolated, something away from campsites and tourist spots. After about an hour of browsing, I found a national forest area about 5 hours away. It had rough trails, some of them rarely used. I printed out a paper map just in case and marked a trail that looped deep through the forest and came back around. It wasn't an official trail, more like a path that hunters and the occasional backpacker used. The next day, I packed everything I thought I'd need. I brought extra food, a small water purifier, a flashlight, backup batteries, a basic first aid kit, a knife, my phone, and a power bank. I also packed a tent and a good sleeping bag. I drove out early in the morning and got to the trailhead around noon. There was no one there. The parking area was just a dirt patch with room for maybe 3 cars. Mine was the only one. The first day of hiking went fine. The weather was clear, not too hot, and there was a light breeze. I followed the overgrown trail into the trees, away from everything. By late afternoon, I had walked several miles and found a flat area near a shallow stream. I set up camp, boiled some water for my freeze-dried meal, and ate while watching the sun go down behind the trees. Felt peaceful. The silence was deep, and the only sounds were the wind and the occasional bird. That night, I slept better than I had in months. The air was cool, the sleeping bag was warm, and I didn't wake up once. The next day, I packed up and kept going deeper. The trail was rougher here. I had to step over fallen logs, push through brush, and sometimes I lost the trail completely and had to backtrack. Still, I liked it. There was a sense of freedom in being that far from everything. Around the middle of the second day, I noticed something odd. I came across what looked like an old fire ring, but it wasn't made of rocks like the usual kind. It was more like a perfect circle of scorched earth, maybe 5 feet wide. The center was blackened, but there were no ashes or signs of wood. It looked like it had been burned a long time ago, but the way it was shaped and how the grass had stopped growing in that circle made me pause. I walked around it, gave it a glance, and moved on. By late afternoon, I reached a small ridge where I could look out over the forest. The view was incredible. Trees stretched out for miles with no sign of roads or buildings. I figured I'd camp up there that night. I found a flat spot a little below the ridge, set up my tent, and sat down with some food. As I ate, I noticed something in the distance, across a small valley. It looked like a narrow clearing, maybe a few 100 feet long, running straight through the trees. It didn't look natural. It was too straight. The map I had didn't show anything there. I decided I'd check it out the next day. Maybe it was an old logging road or something. That night, I didn't sleep as well. I kept waking up. Nothing specific woke me, just this nagging feeling like something wasn't right. I told myself it was just being out in the wild, but I couldn't shake the tension. I heard small noises now and then, twigs snapping, something brushing against bushes, but I told myself it was animals. The next morning, I crossed the valley to check out the clearing. When I got there, I saw it wasn't a clearing at all. It was a trench, a narrow trench maybe 2 feet wide and a foot deep, that ran straight through the woods. It didn't look like it was for drainage. There was no erosion. The sides were clean, like it had been dug and then left. It ran in both directions as far as I could see. I followed it for a while, kept going straight, no curves. I started getting a weird feeling in my gut. I didn't know why. Something about how perfect and clean the trench was made me feel off, like it didn't belong. Eventually, I turned back and hiked another mile or so until I found a new spot to camp. That night, things got worse. I set up camp near a dry creek bed. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you more aware of every sound. I was eating when I heard a low crunch in the trees. I froze. It wasn't a small animal. The sound was heavier, like something stepping on dry leaves and twigs. It stopped after a few seconds. I waited. I didn't hear anything else for a while. I finished eating and sat in the dark for a long time, flashlight off, just listening. The crunching sound didn't come back, but I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. I got into the tent, zipped it up, and kept the flashlight in my hand. I lay there for hours, wide awake. Sometime past midnight, I heard it again, closer this time. A slow, deliberate crunching sound, like footsteps, maybe 30 feet away. I held my breath. It stopped. A few minutes later, I heard it again, circling. Not running, just slow, heavy steps moving around the tent. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just stayed still and listened. After a long while, the sound faded away. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I checked around the tent. Nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing out of place. But I knew what I heard. I didn't want to keep going deeper anymore. I decided to cut the loop short and backtrack toward the trailhead. That day was exhausting. I pushed harder than I should have. I kept looking over my shoulder. Every little sound made me jump. Around mid-afternoon, I reached the burned circle again. Only this time, there were fresh footprints near it. They weren't mine. I had walked around the circle the first time. These were different, larger, deeper. Someone else had been there recently. That night, I camped closer to the stream, trying to get some distance from that spot. I didn't set up the tent. I just rolled out my sleeping bag and laid under a low tree to stay hidden. I didn't eat. I barely drank. I stayed awake all night, gripping the flashlight, heart pounding at every sound. At first light, I got up and started walking. I was 2 days from the trailhead if I moved fast. I walked until my legs burned. I slipped once going down a slope and cut my palm on a sharp rock. I wrapped it in a shirt and kept going. By evening, I reached a flat ridge where I could see the distant hills near where I had parked. I thought I was close, but that night something followed me again. I didn't hear it until it was close. I was laying on my side, staring into the dark, when I heard something step on a branch maybe 20 feet away. I didn't turn on the flashlight. I just stayed still. The sound moved again, slow steps coming around me. I felt exposed. I was on a slight hill with no cover. I waited, not breathing, and then it stopped. The sound didn't come closer, it didn't move away. It just stopped. I stayed awake until the sky turned gray. The last day was the worst. I was sore, barely rested, my water was low, and I had that same heavy feeling in my chest like something wasn't done yet. I pushed hard through the brush, cutting through parts one hadn't been on before to try and shorten the path. I finally saw the dirt patch where my car was parked late in the afternoon. There was another car there, a beat-up pickup, dark green with a tarp in the bed. I slowed down. My hands were sweating. I crouched behind a tree and watched. No one was in the truck. I didn't know how long it had been there. The windows were tinted. The dirt around the tires looked fresh. I didn't wait. I moved fast, straight to my car, unlocked it, tossed my gear in, and started the engine. As I backed out, I glanced at the other truck again. Still no movement. I didn't stop to look. I drove. The paved road didn't come for several miles. I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see headlights behind me, but there was nothing, just empty road. When I hit the highway, I finally relaxed a little. I got home just after dark. I locked the door, closed the blinds, and sat on the floor of my apartment for a long time. I never found out who was out there. I never reported anything. What would I say? That I saw a trench and a burned circle and heard footsteps? That a random truck showed up in the middle of nowhere? There was no proof, no evidence, just a gut-deep feeling that I had come close to something I didn't want to find. I haven't been hiking since. Not like that. Not alone. Not deep into the woods where no one can hear you. Sometimes, at night, I still think about the sound of those footsteps circling me. Slow, steady, watching. I don't usually talk about this, mostly because I've never been able to explain it well to people who weren't there. But writing it down now, I realize it's not about explaining. It's just about remembering it exactly how it happened. I went hiking alone that week, which was a mistake from the start. I wasn't new to it or reckless. I had proper gear, maps, emergency stuff, all that. I'd done plenty of solo hikes before, but this time I chose a trail I hadn't hiked before, Snake Ridge Trail in Wyoming. I picked it because it looked remote and quiet. I was burned out from work and needed peace. The pictures online showed endless pine trees, rocky cliffs, and deep valleys. No phone service, no noise, just nature. It was a Monday morning when I arrived at the trailhead. There was only one other car parked, and it was dusty, so I figured whoever owned it had already been out for at least a day or two. That was fine with me. I signed the trail register like you're supposed to and shouldered my pack. It was around 45 pounds, with enough supplies for 3 days. I planned to hike in about 10 miles the first day, set up camp, and take it easy. On day 2, I'd explore a less marked side trail I saw on a map online, then hike back out on day 3. The first part of the hike was everything I hoped for. Clean air, the quiet hum of wind through pine trees, the crunch of boots on dirt. A few chipmunks darted across the path now and then, and I saw hawks circling above the cliffs in the distance. The trail itself was well maintained at first, even though it wasn't heavily used. Elevation gain was slow and steady. After about 4 hours of hiking, I stopped for lunch near a wide bend in the trail that overlooked a dry streambed. I remember watching a beetle crawl across a rock as I ate a peanut butter sandwich. It was all so quiet. Around 3 p.m., I reached the area where I'd planned to camp. It was a flat patch off the trail with a few scattered boulders and trees that provided enough shade. There was even a small clearing where someone had clearly made a fire pit before. I unpacked my tent, set everything up, and spent the evening just walking around the area, stretching my legs, and checking out the nearby slope that led down into a narrow ravine. I didn't go down far. It was rocky and a bit unstable. I decided I'd check it out more the next day when I wasn't tired. I cooked dinner as the sun started to drop behind the ridge. The shadows stretched long across the clearing, and the wind picked up. It got colder quickly, like it always does up in the mountains. I bundled up and climbed into my sleeping bag early. I had brought a book and a headlamp, but I only made it a few pages in before I started to nod off. I remember hearing a few night sounds, some distant bird calls, the rustling of small animals, but nothing unusual. I woke up once during the night to pee. The moon was out, and the trees were just dark shapes against the silver light. My breath fogged in the air. Everything was still. I climbed back into my sleeping bag and fell asleep again. The next morning, I made oatmeal and coffee. I packed a smaller day pack with water, snacks, and a basic first aid kit. I left my main gear back at the tent since I'd be returning later. The map I had showed a faded line branching off the main trail not far from my campsite. That was the one I wanted to check out. The line ended near what looked like a small lake or pond. I figured it would make a good spot for lunch and some photos. I found the start of the side trail just a quarter mile from my tent. It wasn't marked with any signs, but someone had tied a strip of red fabric to a tree, probably years ago. The trail was thinner and much less clear. It twisted through thick clusters of pine and dipped into shallow gullies that were full of fallen branches. I moved slowly, trying to stay on what little path there was. Occasionally, I saw old boot prints in the dirt, mostly faded, but it told me someone had been through there at some point. After about 2 hours, the trees opened up a little. I stood at the edge of a slope that looked down on a small body of water. It was more like a pond than a lake, greenish and still, with logs floating near the edge. I picked my way down and sat near the water's edge. I took off my boots, let my feet rest, and ate some trail mix and jerky. The sun was warm, and for a while, it felt like the trip was exactly what I needed. But then I started to notice how quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet, just empty. No wind, no birds. I remember looking up and realizing that the treetops weren't moving at all. It wasn't just my imagination either. There was a weird pressure in the air, the way it feels before a storm, but with no clouds. I stood up, suddenly uncomfortable. I decided to head back. I still had hours of daylight, and I wanted to get back to camp with enough time to cook and maybe read more. The slope back up from the pond felt steeper this time. I took the same path back, or I thought I did. First, everything looked familiar. Same trees, same cuts in the dirt, same fallen log I stepped over earlier. But then things started to look off. I passed a rock that I swear I'd passed before, twice, and a pile of old branches that looked too familiar. I checked my compass. I was heading west, the same direction I came in from, but nothing around me looked right anymore. I kept walking. I should have been back at the trail junction in maybe an hour, but it was now pushing 3. The sun was starting to dip again, shadows stretching out. I forced myself to stay calm and pulled out my map and GPS. The GPS had one job: show me where I was, but it wouldn't connect. Just a blank screen with a spinning icon. Useless. I kept walking, more urgently now. I was sweating even though the air was cool. Finally, I saw what looked like a fire pit. Relief hit me for a second. I thought I'd made it back to camp. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't my camp. It was older. Charcoal and ashes buried under pine needles. Rusted tin cans nearby, scattered and bent. Nobody had been there for years. That's when I realized I wasn't just off the trail. I was totally lost. Somehow I had gotten turned around, and now I had no idea where the main path was. I could feel panic building in my chest. I sat down, took deep breaths, and made a decision. I'd find a high point. If I could get above the tree line or even just to a ridge, I could spot the trail or at least the pond again. I walked uphill for what felt like forever. The trees thinned out slightly, but not enough to get a clear view. My legs burned from climbing, and my stomach was turning from hunger and stress. I ate the last of my jerky and sipped water. I tried to think clearly, not let fear cloud my judgment. By the time the sun started to set, I still hadn't found my camp. I didn't have much choice now. I'd have to spend the night where I was. I had my emergency bivvy, a foil blanket, and extra clothes in my day pack. I set up near a rock wall that could block some of the wind and made a small fire with my lighter and some dry bark. I didn't sleep much. Every snap of a twig in the dark made my heart race. I heard something larger moving through the trees once. Maybe a deer, but I never saw it. Morning came gray and cold. I was stiff, tired, and scared, but I had to move. I decided to head downhill. Water always runs downhill, and trails usually follow water sources. After 2 more hours of stumbling through brush and thick trees, I heard something. The sound of rushing water. It was faint, but it was there. I followed it, slipping down rocky slopes, branches whipping against my face, thorns scratching my arms. Eventually, I reached a narrow creek. The water was fast and cold. I filled my bottle and followed it downstream. After maybe another hour, I saw something that nearly brought me to tears. An old wooden bridge crossing the creek. It was broken in the middle and useless now, but that meant people had been here once. Not far from there, I found a trail. A real one. Narrow and rough, but clearly a hiking trail. I didn't know which direction led where, but I picked one and walked. 3 more hours. That's how long it took before I stumbled out onto the main Snake Ridge Trail. I recognized it instantly. The bend in the path, the large boulder I'd stopped at on day 1. I nearly dropped to my knees. My legs were shaking, my feet were blistered, and my body ached. But I wasn't lost anymore. I made it back to my tent by sunset. It was untouched, just as I left it. I packed up in silence, barely stopping to eat. I hiked back out the next morning, slowly and carefully. When I got to the trailhead, the other car was gone. Mine was the only one there. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time before starting the engine. My hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from how close I had come to disappearing out there. All it took was one wrong turn. One decision to follow a faint trail that wasn't on any official map. I still don't know how I got so far off course. I thought I was prepared, thought I knew how to read the land. But nature doesn't care about that. I don't hike alone anymore, not in unfamiliar places. I always tell someone exactly where I'm going and when I'll be back. I carry better GPS equipment now, but most of all, I listen to my gut. That feeling. I was 31 when I decided to take a solo hiking trip in the late summer of 2022. Life had been weighing me down. Same old routine, same cramped apartment, same noisy street. I wanted silence. I wanted space. I wanted to be somewhere I didn't have to hear car horns or phone alerts. That's how I found Black Hollow Trail. It wasn't even that far. About a 5-hour drive from where I lived in Ohio, tucked deep in the Allegheny Mountains of Pennsylvania. I found the trail on a hiking forum. People talked about how peaceful it was, how quiet and untouched it felt. Not many people hiked it, they said, and some parts were hardly marked. That sounded perfect to me. I wanted off the grid. Just me, my backpack, and the woods. I spent a week getting ready. I made lists. I packed my gear. I checked everything 3 times. I wasn't new to hiking. I'd done smaller trails, camped in the woods, filtered water from streams. But this would be my longest hike yet. The whole loop of Black Hollow Trail was supposed to be around 23 miles, but it was known for its poor signage and overgrown forks. Some said it felt more like 30 miles when you finished. That didn't bother me. I wanted to get lost in the good way. What I didn't expect was to get lost in the real way. I got to the trailhead around 9 a.m. on a Wednesday. No one else was there. The parking lot was small, just gravel and a faded map on a sign. I stretched, shouldered my pack, locked the car, and stepped onto the trail. The first few hours were exactly what I'd hoped for. It was quiet, really quiet. Not the kind of quiet you get in parks or towns. This was deep woods silence. Only the wind, the birds, the occasional crack of a twig under my boots. The trail itself was narrow and lined with ferns and thick undergrowth. Sunlight barely made it through the dense trees. I followed orange trailblazes painted on trees every so often. Some were faded. A few were barely visible, like the bark had grown over them. I hiked for about 5 hours that day, stopping for water breaks and lunch. My plan was to make camp near a spot others online had mentioned, a clearing by a small creek around mile 10. I wanted to break the trail into 2 days, camp out one night, finish the loop the next day, then drive home. But around mid-afternoon, things started to feel off. First, I missed a blaze. I didn't realize it until I noticed the trail narrowing more than it should have. It turned rocky and steep. I pulled out my phone to check my GPS, but of course, there was no signal. That hadn't surprised me. I downloaded an offline map before I came, but it wasn't much help. The lines on it were vague. There were no markers for where I was. I turned back and retraced my steps. After maybe 15 minutes, I found the last blaze I remembered and followed it forward again, watching carefully this time. I spotted the next one on a fallen tree that had tipped sideways. Whoever painted it must have done it before the tree fell, and now it was half buried under moss. By the time I reached the creek, it was almost dusk. The clearing wasn't as open as I imagined. It was just a flat patch of dirt surrounded by dense trees and brush. Still, it would do. I set up my tent, filtered water, cooked a meal from a freeze-dried pack, and sat in silence, listening to the woods. That night was cold. Not freezing, but colder than I expected. I bundled deeper into my sleeping bag, trying to block out the strange sounds outside the tent. Every snap of a twig made my ears perk up. I tried not to let my mind wander. I knew there were animals out here, probably raccoons or deer. I'd stored my food in a bear bag and hung it from a tree. I wasn't new to this. I fell asleep at some point, but I kept waking up. The air felt too still. There was no wind, no owls, no crickets, just complete silence between the occasional twig snap. Around 3 a.m., I heard heavy steps near the tent. Not a bear, not light like a deer either. Just slow, steady steps, maybe 4 or 5 of them, and then nothing. I stayed frozen, barely breathing. I didn't open the zipper. I didn't want to know. The next morning, everything looked normal. No torn-up bag, no tracks I could see. I packed up and tried to shake it off. The trail started steep again after that. I was supposed to rejoin the main loop and head back toward the parking lot. But that's when I realized I'd made another mistake. The path split at some point. There were no blazes at all. I took what I thought was the main way, but it just kept going uphill, winding sharply. I followed it for maybe 2 hours before I stopped to rest and drink some water. I was sweating badly, even though the air was cool. My knees hurt from climbing. I checked my map again. It didn't match what I was seeing. The creek I'd passed that morning was nowhere to be found on the map. Or maybe I'd passed a different one. I started to panic a little, but I kept walking. I figured I had to be circling back eventually. But then I reached a wide open space, an old logging area, maybe. The trees were gone, replaced by thorny undergrowth and low shrubs. The trail disappeared entirely. I looked around for any blazes or footprints, but there was nothing, just silence and empty space. I pulled out my compass and checked my direction. I tried to remember the sun's position from the day before. I thought I was heading west, but nothing looked familiar. That's when it hit me. I was off trail, really off trail. I stood still for a long time, just listening. I hoped I'd hear something, voices, an engine, even distant traffic. But there was only the breeze. I tried to backtrack, but the way I'd come was impossible to follow now. The bushes were thick, and the ground was uneven. Every path I took led nowhere or looped back to the same place. I stopped walking around 5 p.m. My feet were sore. My thighs ached. I was nearly out of water, and I hadn't eaten since morning. I found a patch of ground beneath a pine tree and set up my tent again, though it didn't feel like camp anymore. Felt like shelter, like I was hiding. That night, I barely slept. My stomach growled. My legs cramped. I kept the flashlight close. Around midnight, I thought I heard something crashing through the brush nearby. Something big, but it never got closer. Maybe it was an elk. Maybe it was nothing. The next morning, I told myself I had to pick a direction and follow it. I remembered a trick I'd heard. If you follow a stream downhill, it'll usually lead to a road or a bigger water source. I spent hours searching for one. Eventually, I found a shallow trickle. Not much, but enough to count. I followed it. It twisted and cut through rocky ground, but at least it gave me a line to follow. Hours passed. The sun moved overhead. The water got deeper in spots, then vanished into rocks again. I slipped and fell more than once. My pack scraped my back. My lips were dry. I was running out of food. Only one more freeze-dried meal left. By late afternoon, I saw something. An old hunting blind, half collapsed, nailed into a tree. It was falling apart, covered in vines, but it was man-made. I was close to something. I climbed a ridge beside it and spotted a faint dirt path. Not a hiking trail, maybe an old ATV trail or a service road, but it was wide and somewhat clear. I followed it, trying not to get too excited. It went on for miles. The trees changed thinner, more spaced out. I started seeing signs of logging, sawdust piles, broken stumps, trash, beer cans, faded tire tracks. Then I saw the cabin. It was small, old, and falling apart. A tin roof with holes, with slats coming loose. I approached carefully, looking for signs of life. No smoke, no movement. I knocked on the door out of instinct, then remembered there was no one to answer. I pushed it open and stepped inside. It was empty, dusty. Some broken furniture, a collapsed bed, old magazines. But it was shelter. I stayed the night. It was better than the tent. No wind inside, just stale air and silence. The next day, I followed the dirt road that led past the cabin. I had no idea where it went, but it was the only thing resembling a direction. Around noon, I heard the sound of an engine. I almost cried. I ran toward it, crashing through brush. A man on an ATV appeared, middle-aged, wearing a camo jacket. He looked shocked to see me. I must have looked like hell, muddy, scratched up, sunburned. He took me to a ranger station about 12 miles away. I learned I'd been lost for 3 days. My car was still in the lot. No one had reported me missing because I hadn't told anyone where I was going. Just left a note at home saying, "Gone hiking." They said people sometimes got turned around on Black Hollow. Poor signage, faded blazes. The area where I'd wandered off had no service and hadn't been maintained in years. I was lucky to have found that old road. I drove home in silence. Every bump on the road made my muscles ache. I stopped at a gas station and bought 3 bottles of water and a sandwich. I'd never tasted anything better. I still hike, but I don't go alone anymore. It was early October when I decided to go on a solo hiking trip through a national forest in northern Idaho. I had taken time off work after a long stretch of deadlines, and I needed to reset my head. I'd done solo hikes before, but never in a place this remote. The area I chose wasn't as popular as others, and it promised miles of thick forests, steep terrain, and long stretches of trail where I'd likely not see another person for days. That's what I wanted. Peace, isolation, and distance from everything that had been crowding my life. I parked my car at a small gravel turnout along a Forest Service road. There was no official parking lot, just a handmade sign nailed to a tree with faded red letters marking the start of the trail. I double-checked the supplies in my pack: tent, sleeping bag, small camp stove, enough food for a week, water filter, maps, compass, and my emergency beacon. I knew how quickly things could go wrong in the backcountry, especially with no cell service. The first day of hiking was beautiful. The trail wound through dense pine forests, and the air smelled clean and cold. The ground was covered in layers of pine needles, softening each step. I didn't rush. I took my time, stopping to rest and snack every few miles. The sun dipped early behind the trees, casting long shadows across the path, so I made camp well before dark. I set up my tent beside a small stream and made a simple meal of rice and dehydrated vegetables. I sat against a log and listened to the wind moving through the trees. It was quiet in a way that's hard to describe, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. I fell asleep fast. The second day was harder. The terrain got steeper and the trail less obvious. I had to rely more on my map than the markers, which were now faded or completely missing. The forest got thicker, too. Every direction looked the same. I used my compass constantly to make sure I was heading the right way. Around mid-afternoon, I passed an old wooden shelter. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. Half the roof had caved in and moss was growing on the beams. I thought about stopping there, but it gave me a weird feeling. Something about how silent it was around the structure, like the forest was holding its breath. I kept moving. That night, I camped in a clearing that sloped gently down toward a marshy area. I hung my food and set up my tent like usual, but I had trouble falling asleep. I kept hearing noises outside, not animal sounds, just faint snaps and rustles, like someone was walking slowly through the brush. Every time I sat up and unzipped the tent to look, there was nothing, just trees and the occasional chirp of a night bird. I told myself it was deer or maybe a porcupine. On the third day, I got turned around. I missed a fork in the trail and didn't realize it until hours later. I checked my compass and figured out where I went wrong, but instead of backtracking, I decided to cut across a ridge and reconnect with the trail that way. It was stupid. The map made it look doable, but it didn't show the loose shale or the thick underbrush I had to fight through. It took longer than I thought, and by the time I made it back to the trail, the sun was low and my legs were shredded. I didn't even eat dinner that night. I set up camp in a hurry and crawled into my sleeping bag. That night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Not animal footsteps. Slow, deliberate crunching of leaves and twigs, like someone trying not to make noise but failing. I held my breath and listened. The steps came closer, then stopped. I could hear my own heart thudding. I didn't move. My knife was in my pack outside the tent. I lay there for what felt like an hour. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep. In the morning, I checked around the tent. There were no tracks, at least nothing clear, but I felt watched, like something was near. I packed up fast and hiked all day, putting as much distance as I could between me and that spot. I didn't stop to eat. I barely drank water. I just wanted to get deeper into the trail loop and away from whatever had been out there. On the 5th day, I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in a long time. I thought maybe I'd missed a turn again. The trail underfoot still looked like a path, but it was narrower, more overgrown. I followed it for miles before admitting to myself that I wasn't on the loop anymore. I pulled out my map and tried to figure out where I'd gone wrong, but the trees all looked the same. The ridges didn't line up with the contours on the paper. I was somewhere off the trail and I didn't know where. I decided to keep heading east. If I could get to the ridge, I'd be able to see the valley and maybe spot the logging road where I'd parked. The climb was brutal. Loose rocks, thorny bushes, thick branches smacking my face and arms. I slipped more than once. My legs were bleeding. My hands were scratched raw from grabbing trees and rocks. At the top, there was no view, just more trees. The forest stretched out endlessly in every direction. I realized then just how lost I really was. I felt something heavy settle in my chest. Panic. I forced it down. I had enough supplies for a few more days. I had my emergency beacon, but I told myself I'd only use it if things got worse. That night, I made camp in a dense cluster of fir trees. The ground was uneven and damp. I kept hearing those footsteps again. This time they didn't stop. They circled the tent. Slow, dragging footsteps that moved around and around. I didn't move. Couldn't. My body had gone stiff with fear. It was like a nightmare. I couldn't bring myself to unzip the tent. Eventually, the sounds faded. I don't know when I fell asleep. In the morning, I saw something that stopped me cold. A pile of small stones had been placed outside my tent door, carefully stacked, about a foot high. I didn't do that. No wind or animal did that. My chest felt tight again. I packed everything in a rush and didn't bother eating. I just started walking. I didn't care what direction. I just needed to get out. I followed the slope downward, hoping I'd run into a creek or road. Hours passed. I tripped and fell constantly. My legs were trembling. My water was almost gone. I filled up from a muddy stream and used my filter, but it tasted off. Metallic. I spat most of it out. Then I saw something through the trees, cut logs. A trail of them. I followed the pattern and found a logging road. It wasn't on my map, but it meant I wasn't deep in the middle anymore. I hiked along the road until my legs gave out. I collapsed beside a ditch and stayed there for a while. When I got up, the sun was setting again. I knew I had to use the emergency beacon. I couldn't keep walking. My legs were barely holding me up. I sat on a rock and pressed the button. It took them over 12 hours to reach me. A Forest Service rescue team came in on ATVs. They looked surprised to find me in one piece. I had scratches and bruises all over my body, and I hadn't eaten in 2 days. They gave me water, protein bars, and checked my vitals. One of them asked if I'd seen anyone else out there. I shook my head. When they dropped me off at my car, I felt like I was waking up from a bad dream. The whole thing felt unreal, but it had happened. I looked back at the trailhead one last time before getting in the car. The sign was still there, crooked and faded. I drove for hours until I reached a small motel. I took the longest shower of my life and stared at my reflection in the mirror. I looked like I'd aged a year in 5 days. I didn't tell anyone the full story, just that I got lost and had to be rescued. I didn't mention the footsteps or the stones or the feeling of being watched. I didn't want people to think I was making it up. But something was out there. I don't know what. I've done hikes since then, but never solo and never that deep into the woods. Something changed in me on that trip. I still hear those footsteps sometimes, in my dreams, always circling, always waiting. I've always liked hiking alone. There's something about the quiet, the slow pace, the rhythm of my boots hitting the dirt that calms me. I like to go off the grid for a few days, just me and nature. I plan carefully, pack the right gear, leave a copy of my route with someone I trust, and try not to take unnecessary risks. I've hiked all over, from the Rockies to the Appalachians, and I've always made it back without much more than a blister or a sunburn. But what happened on a trail up north in Minnesota last summer changed the way I think about being out there alone. It made me realize how fast everything can go wrong, and how small and helpless you can feel when it does. I had about a week off between jobs, and I wanted to use it right. I picked a remote trail system in the Superior National Forest, far from the more popular parks. It wasn't listed on most mainstream hiking blogs, which is what I liked about it. The plan was to hike a loop of about 45 miles over 4 days, staying off established campsites and just finding my own spots to sleep each night. The weather was supposed to be good, cool, dry, no storms in the forecast. I drove up the night before and slept in my car at the trailhead. By sunrise, I was geared up and on the trail. The first day was exactly what I hoped for. The forest was thick and green, with a steady breeze rustling the treetops. I didn't see another person the entire day. The path was narrow but well marked. I moved slowly, enjoying the quiet. Around 6, I found a flat spot near a creek and set up camp. I cooked some food, sat by the water for a while, then crawled into my sleeping bag and passed out. The second day was when things started to shift. It wasn't anything dramatic at first, just a feeling like I wasn't as alone as I thought. Every now and then I'd stop walking and listen. I'd hear a twig snap somewhere off the trail or the rustling of underbrush. But when I looked, I didn't see anything. That isn't unusual in the woods. There are animals everywhere. Deer, squirrels, maybe even a black bear. Still, the uneasiness stuck with me. I kept hiking, figuring it was just my mind playing tricks on me. By late afternoon, I'd covered about 12 miles. My legs were tired and my feet were starting to ache. I hadn't seen a soul since I started. I found another spot to camp, this one a bit higher up on a ridge with a decent view of the trees below. I set up my tent, boiled water for my meal, and tried to shake the strange feeling I'd had all day. It wasn't fear exactly, just tension, like I was being watched. I even did a full circle around the ridge before turning in, just to be sure I was alone. That night, I woke up around 2 in the morning to the sound of footsteps. Not the soft rustle of an animal moving through the grass. These were distinct, deliberate, crunching footsteps on dried leaves. They were close, maybe 30 or 40 feet from my tent. I froze in my sleeping bag. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I waited, hoping the sound would fade away, but it didn't. It circled. Slow, steady steps around my tent. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure whoever it was could hear it. I reached silently for the knife I always kept near me when I camped. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't call out. I just laid there with my hand on the handle, sweating and waiting. After what felt like forever, the footsteps stopped. I stayed frozen for another hour, maybe more, before I finally drifted off again. When I woke up at dawn, everything was still. No sign of anyone or anything nearby, but the dry leaves around my tent were disturbed, crushed in a pattern that looked too wide for a deer or small animal. I packed up quickly and moved fast that day. I knew I wasn't imagining it anymore. Someone had been out there, Whether they were just passing through or watching me, I didn't know. But I wanted to be out of those woods sooner than later. I made the call to shorten the loop and take a shortcut through a connector trail that would bring me back to the trailhead a day early. It meant a longer hike that day, maybe 18 miles, but I was okay with that. I wanted out. Around midday, I noticed that the trail markers were getting harder to find. The path was narrow and looked less traveled. At one point, I had to backtrack a quarter mile when I realized I'd gone the wrong way. I checked my map and GPS. The connection trail was on there, but it wasn't as clearly marked. I kept moving, staying alert, checking behind me now and then. That afternoon, I found something that made my stomach drop. Hanging from a branch just above eye level was a strip of blue cloth. It was faded and torn at the end, like it had been out there for a while. It was tied in a simple knot, dangling right in the middle of the trail. I stopped and stared at it for a long time. It looked too deliberate, like a marker. Maybe someone left it for themselves, or maybe it was a warning. I thought about turning back, but I was already deep into the shortcut trail, and going back would mean another night out here, so I kept going. The trail kept getting harder to follow. The ground was uneven and rocky, and I was constantly checking my GPS. I passed more of those cloth strips, some blue, some red, some yellow. They were tied to branches or tucked into bark. All of them looked old, weathered, like they'd been there for months or longer. I didn't like it. It didn't feel right. There were too many of them, and they didn't follow a consistent pattern. Some were close together, others spaced far apart. I kept moving. Around 5, I figured I still had 5 or 6 miles to go. That's when I saw the first one. Off the trail, maybe 15 feet into the trees, was a broken down tent. It was collapsed in on itself, dirty and covered in leaves. It looked abandoned. I walked over to it, slowly. There were no bags or gear around it, just the torn tent. I didn't touch it. I didn't want to. I just stood there, staring at it. It looked like it had been there a while. But the strange thing was, it wasn't weathered the way I'd expect. The poles were snapped, but the fabric didn't look moldy or torn. It looked like it had been deliberately pulled down. I backed away and got back on the trail. I walked faster. My feet hurt. My shoulders ached from the pack, but I pushed. Every now and then, I thought I heard footsteps behind me. I'd stop and listen. Nothing, just the wind in the trees. Then I'd start walking again. I didn't want to stop until I was out. Just before dark, I made it to a small clearing. There was a fire ring made of stones, with old blackened wood still inside it. It wasn't mine. It wasn't marked on my map. I wasn't even sure it was an official camp, but I was too tired to keep going. I set up my tent fast and made a quick dinner. I kept my knife closer this time. I didn't sleep much. Every snap of a branch outside made me jump. At some point in the night, I swear I heard breathing. Slow, quiet, just outside the tent wall. But when I opened the flap in the morning, no one was there. I didn't bother eating breakfast. I packed and moved. The last few miles felt like the longest of my life. The trail was barely visible. I had to stop every 10 minutes to make sure I was still on it. I passed another collapsed tent, this one half buried in dirt. I didn't stop to look. I just kept going. At one point, I saw boot prints in the mud. Not mine. They were fresher. They pointed the same direction I was going. Around noon, I finally saw the trailhead through the trees. I broke into a jog, stumbling a bit under the weight of my pack. I got to my car, dropped my gear inside, and locked the doors. I sat there for a long time, just breathing. When I finally drove out, I didn't stop until I reached the nearest gas station with a signal. I called the local ranger office and told them what I'd seen, the tents, the cloth strips, the feeling that someone might be out there following hikers. They said they'd send someone to check it out. Maybe they did. I never heard back. I still hike. I still go out alone sometimes, but I stay on well-marked trails now. I don't go looking for the most remote places anymore. That trip reminded me how easy it is to disappear out there, how easy it is to be followed without knowing it, and how fast things can go wrong when you're miles from help. Whatever was out there with me, whether it was one person or more, I never saw their face. I never found out what they wanted. but I think about them every time I step off the road and into the trees. And I always wonder if they're still out there, waiting for the next person who thinks they're alone. I decided to hike alone that summer, mostly because I needed to clear my head. My life back home had started to feel like a loop. I had just quit a job I didn't love, ended a relationship that had gone cold, and felt like I was floating with no direction. A long solo hike seemed like the kind of thing that could snap me out of that fog. So I started looking for a trail that wasn't too touristy but still safe enough for a solo trip. I settled on the Bear Hollow Trail in northern Idaho. It was remote, but not completely off the grid. It had a mix of thick forest, old logging roads, and high ridgelines, the kind of place you could walk all day without seeing another person, but not so far out that I'd be totally cut off if something went wrong. I planned a 4-day loop with 3 nights of camping. I packed carefully. I had a detailed map, compass, backup GPS, extra batteries, food, a tent, sleeping bag, and even a bear canister. I wasn't reckless. I'd done solo hikes before, just not this deep or this long. The first day went smoothly. I started early, parking my car at the trailhead just after sunrise. The air was crisp, and the trail smelled like pine needles and damp earth. I passed through narrow switchbacks, open meadows with knee-high grass, and long stretches of quiet forest where the only sound was the crunch of my boots. By late afternoon, I had made it to a small clearing near a stream, just like I'd planned. I pitched my tent, ate a freeze-dried meal, and fell asleep with the sound of water nearby. The second day was when things started to feel off. Not wrong exactly, just off. About 2 hours into my morning hike, I reached a ridge that overlooked a wide valley. It was beautiful. Pine trees stretched for miles, broken only by the occasional meadow or rock slide. I stopped to drink water and take it in. That's when I saw someone down in the valley. At first, it looked like a dot moving across the green. I squinted. It was a man hiking in the same direction as me, but way off trail. He was moving slowly, kind of zigzagging through the trees, not following any visible path. I watched him for a minute or two, assuming he was a backcountry hunter or maybe just another hiker who liked bushwhacking. But something about the way he moved didn't look right. He kept stopping, standing still for long stretches, and then suddenly moving again. It was strange, but I didn't think too hard about it. I assumed he didn't even see me. I packed up and kept hiking, thinking I'd be far ahead of him by the time I made camp that night. The rest of the day was uneventful. I crossed a couple of small streams, passed through some overgrown sections where branches scratched my arms, and didn't see a single soul. Around 5:30 p.m., I found a nice spot under a stand of tall trees, flat and dry, with a good view of the sunset over the ridge. I set up camp, made dinner, and sat by my tiny fire, letting my legs rest. I hadn't thought about the guy in the valley for hours. I was dozing off in my sleeping bag when I heard something outside. It wasn't an animal. The sound was slow, deliberate. Footsteps. They stopped right outside my tent. I froze. Every part of my body tensed. I could hear my own heartbeat. Then the sound moved, a few steps to the right, then silence. I waited. Minutes passed. Nothing. Eventually, I built up the nerve to unzip the tent just a little and look out with my flashlight. There was no one there. I got out fully and checked the area. I circled the tent. Nothing. No people. No animals. No signs anyone had been there. The pine needles on the ground were thick, and it was hard to see tracks, but I saw what looked like one partial boot print, pressed lightly into the dirt about 10 feet from my tent. It was wide and deep, not mine. I had a smaller foot, and I'd been careful to set camp without wandering that far. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I felt tired but tried to brush it off. Maybe it had been a deer or elk walking close. Maybe my mind had exaggerated the sound. I told myself that and started hiking again. Around midday, I crossed an old logging road and stopped to eat a granola bar. That's when I saw him again. This time, he was about 200 yards away, standing completely still near the tree line. He was wearing a dark green jacket and dark pants. His hands hung at his sides. He wasn't walking or looking at the scenery. He was looking straight at me. It was a long stare. I looked back for maybe 10 seconds, then quickly packed my food and started moving again. I didn't run, but I didn't hike slowly either. I kept looking over my shoulder every few minutes, but I didn't see him again that day. That night, I didn't set up camp at the planned spot. I kept hiking for another 2 hours until the sun started dropping behind the hills, and I found a hidden little shelf of land tucked between some rocks. It wasn't the flattest, and it didn't have much space, but I thought it might be harder for someone to find. I didn't light a fire. I didn't cook anything. I just lay in my tent, wide awake, listening. Every crack of a branch or rustle of wind made me jump. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps again, but it was too far off to tell. I slept maybe an hour that night. When morning came, I didn't waste any time. I packed up fast and decided to cut the hike short. I could follow a secondary trail that would loop me back toward the trailhead, shaving off the last day. It would be a longer hike, maybe 15 miles in one day, but I wanted out. I walked fast, almost jogged at times. My legs burned, and my shoulders ached from the pack, but I pushed hard. I kept thinking about the way that man looked at me. No wave, no nod, just that long stare, like he was deciding something. Around 2 p.m., I came across something that stopped me cold. There was a shirt tied to a tree branch. It wasn't just hanging like someone dropped it. It was tied deliberately, in a knot. A gray t-shirt. I didn't recognize it. It wasn't mine. There was nothing else nearby, no sign of a person, no backpack, no camp. Just the shirt, swinging gently in the breeze. I didn't touch it. I just moved on, walking even faster now. An hour later, I noticed something even worse. Footprints, fresh ones, on the trail ahead of me. At first, I thought they could be from another hiker, but they matched the boot print I had seen near my tent 2 nights earlier. Same wide sole, same deep heel pattern, and they were heading the same direction I was going. It meant whoever made them was ahead of me now. I stopped for a long minute, unsure what to do. Couldn't go back. I didn't want to risk bushwhacking off trail, so I kept going, but quietly now, trying to avoid stepping on sticks or loose gravel. About 45 minutes later, I heard movement in the trees ahead. I dropped down behind a fallen log and waited. The sound got closer. Someone was walking, no pacing. I peeked over the log. About 50 yards ahead, I saw the same man. He was standing beside the trail, pacing back and forth between 2 trees. He looked agitated, like he was waiting for something. I couldn't see his face well, but his posture was tense. He kept looking down the trail in the direction I was coming from. I stayed low and backed up slowly, heart racing. I had to go around him. I moved into the trees and made a wide loop going uphill through thick brush and loose rocks. It was slow, painful work, and I had to stop often to catch my breath. I slipped once and tore a hole in my pants, scraped my leg, kept going. Eventually, I dropped back down to the trail, maybe a mile ahead of where he had been. I didn't see him again, but I didn't feel safe either. The last stretch of trail seemed to take forever. Every bend felt like it might reveal him again. I checked over my shoulder constantly. My legs hurt, my back ached. I was dehydrated and out of snacks. By the time I reached my car, the sun was starting to set. I unlocked the door, threw my pack inside, and sat there for a minute with the door shut, just breathing. Then I started the engine and left. I didn't call the police. What would I say? I saw a man who stared at me and maybe walked near my tent? He didn't do anything illegal, but something about him wasn't right. A week later, I saw a local news article online. A hiker had gone missing in the same area. A man in his late 30s. They found his car at the same trailhead. He'd been missing for 6 days. No known mental health issues. No sign of foul play at the trailhead. They hadn't found his body yet. They posted a photo. It was the man I'd seen. The same jacket. Same face. The man I had seen twice. But he was the one who was missing. And I still don't understand how that makes sense. Maybe he was alive when I saw him. Maybe he was lost and scared and didn't know how to ask for help. Or maybe he was already long dead, and the man I saw wasn't him. But no, that's stupid. More likely, someone else was wearing his clothes. And that's the thought that keeps me up at night. Not the idea of ghosts or spirits. But the idea that someone found that missing man and then decided to stay out there waiting